2:17 p.m., January 17, 1945, Lance Corporal Carl Engelmann lay flat against the frozen concrete bank of the Vistula River, his trembling fingers clutching the detonator. Through his binoculars, he saw something that turned his blood to ice. On the iron railroad bridge of Modlin, exactly 340 meters in front of him, Soviet T-34 tanks were rolling. Not 10, not 20, 200. An endless steel serpent stretching across the 520-meter bridge. But that wasn't the worst of it. Interspersed among the Soviet tanks, desperately trying to escape to the German side, were the last 3 Tiger tanks of his own 4th Panzer Division. 15 German soldiers, his comrades, his friends. Engelmann's right thumb hovered over the red button. A single movement, 3 millimeters. That was all that stood between a tactical triumph and the certain death of his own men. The Soviet vanguard commander, Colonel Dmitry Morozov, at that very moment, had no idea that he and 673 of his men had only 90 seconds to live. Carl Engelmann wasn't an ordinary soldier. Born on March 12, 1923, in Essen, the son of a mining engineer, he had already worked in his father's coal mines at the age of 16. There, he learned something that would later save his life: how to precisely calculate explosive charges, how to analyze load-bearing structures, how to cause maximum structural damage with minimal explosions. When he was drafted into the Wehrmacht in April 1941, his assignment to the combat engineers was inevitable. 3 years of combat engineer school in Dessau, specializing in bridge demolition under enemy fire. The combat engineer school in Dessau was brutal. Of the 340 recruits who started in April 1941, only 89 completed the full training. The rest were either discharged or transferred to other units. The training included 2,400 hours of theoretical instruction and 3,600 hours of practical training: mathematics, physics, chemistry, statics, materials science. Engelmann learned how a bridge was built so that he could learn how to destroy it. He learned the stress points of steel, the weak points of concrete, the exact placement of explosive charges to achieve maximum damage with minimum explosive force. His instructor, Captain Werner Kessler, a veteran of World War I, had personally selected Engelmann for specialized training in bridge demolition under enemy fire. Kessler had said, "Engelmann, you have something that most soldiers don't have. You can calculate under pressure. When shells are exploding around you, you can still do trigonometry. That is the most valuable skill of a combat engineer." Engelmann's first real bridge demolition was in June 1943 near Kursk, a small wooden bridge over the Psel River. He had 47 kilograms of explosives, 12 minutes to work, Soviet vanguard 800 meters away. He calculated, placed, wired, detonated. The bridge fell exactly as predicted. Kessler had patted him on the shoulder afterward. "That was by the book, Engelmann. Now forget the book. Nothing ever goes by the book in real combat." The situation leading up to this moment had been desperate. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army had launched the Vistula Oder offensive. 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,160 tanks, 4,772 aircraft, against 400,000 exhausted German defenders. The 4th Panzer Division, once a proud formation with 160 tanks, had been reduced to 14 Tiger tanks and 9 Panzerabwehrs. Their mission: to cover the retreat of the 9th Army across the Vistula River. The Modlin Bridge was the last functioning crossing within an 80-kilometer radius. 3 days earlier, on January 14th, Major Heinrich Vollmer, commander of the 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion, had given Engelmann an impossible task: place 840 kilograms of explosives under the main supports of the bridge. Prepare electrical detonators. Await my direct order. But Major Volmer was dead, killed by Soviet artillery at 11:23 a.m. on January 16th. His last radio message to Engelmann: wait until the last German unit is across the bridge. Then detonate immediately. Don't let the Russians have an inch of German soil on this side of the Vistula. It had taken Engelmann 36 hours to install the explosive charges. Alone, his entire combat engineer team was either dead or wounded. He worked at night, hanging under the bridge, in -18 degrees Celsius, while Soviet patrols controlled the eastern bank only 200 meters away. 8 main charges, 14 secondary charges, all connected with double electrical detonators. A main line. A backup line. German thoroughness even in the face of annihilation. The 36 hours were hell. Engelmann started at 2:30 a.m. on January 15th. Complete darkness. He carried 105 kilograms of equipment on his back. Explosives, detonators, tools, cables. He climbed under the bridge, hanging from safety ropes he had installed himself. The temperature was -18 degrees Celsius. His fingers were numb after 20 minutes. But he couldn't stop. Every charge had to be positioned exactly. The first main charge took 4 hours. He had to analyze an 890mm thick steel beam, find the exact weak point, attach the charge, wire the detonators. All in the dark, only with a small red flashlight that he held with his teeth. Several times he almost slipped. The safety rope held, but his heart raced each time. At 6:45 a.m. on January 15th, he heard voices, Russian voices. A Soviet patrol only 50 meters away on the eastern bank. He froze, hanging under the bridge, 8 meters above the icy water, surrounded by enough explosives to tear him to pieces. The patrol stayed for 17 minutes. Engelmann heard them smoking, laughing, talking about their families. Then they moved on. He breathed again. Every evening he had to retreat before Soviet reconnaissance aircraft arrived. Every morning at 2 a.m. he returned. On the second evening, January 16th at 6:30 p.m., something terrible happened. One of his explosive crates slipped from his hand. It fell 8 meters, directly into the water. 105 kilograms of highly explosive material sunk in the mud of the Vistula River. Engelmann now had only 735 kilograms, not enough for a guaranteed demolition of the entire bridge. He had to improvise, recalculate, perfectly optimize every charge. The last charge was placed at 11:47 a.m. on January 17th. Engelmann had worked for 36 hours practically without sleep. His hands were bloody. His fingers were black with frostbite. But it was done. 8 main charges, perfectly placed. 14 secondary charges as reinforcement, double electrical wiring, backup systems. He tested the connections 3 times. Everything was functional. The bridge was ready to die. He just didn't know when. And he didn't know that in 5 hours, he would have to make the hardest decision of his life. The first Soviet tanks reached the bridge at 1:47 p.m. Lance Corporal Engelmann lay in his position, the detonator in front of him on a makeshift wooden table. Through his binoculars, he watched as the first T-34s cautiously drove onto the bridge, 10 kilometers per hour. Testing. Careful. The Soviet commander was no fool. He knew that German combat engineers were masters of bridge demolition, but then, at 2:09 p.m., something unexpected happened. From the west, from the German side, 3 Tiger tanks emerged from a burning forest. Engelmann's heart clinched. He recognized the tactical numbers. Tiger 224, Commander Lieutenant Hans Müller from Munich, 23 years old, newly married. Tiger 301, Commander Staff Sergeant Fritz Hartmann from Berlin, a father of 3. Tiger 417. Commander Private First Class Werner Schmidt from Hamburg, the best shot in the division. The Soviet tanks on the bridge stopped. Confusion, hesitation. The German Tigers fired on the move. One T-34 exploded, then a second. Panic among the Soviets. But the overwhelming force was crushing. For every German tank, there were 67 Soviet ones. Colonel Morozov, in his command tank, 400 meters east of the bridge, saw his chance. He radioed to all units. Full speed across the bridge. Annihilate the German tanks on the other side. The entire 47th Guards Tank Brigade began to roll. 200 T-34 tanks, each weighing 26.5 tons. The bridge, built in 1912 for railway trains, began to creak under a total load of 5,300 tons of moving steel. Engelmann reached for the radio. Tiger tank frequency. His voice was shaking. Tiger 224. This is Combat Engineer Engelmann. Bridge is prepared for demolition. Immediate retreat required. The answer came from Lieutenant Müller. His voice was calm, almost serene. Engelmann, our transmission is damaged. We are driving at a maximum of 8 kilometers per hour. Need another 4 minutes to reach the bridge. Hold. 4 minutes. Engelmann looked at his watch, 2:11 p.m. He looked through his binoculars. The Soviet tanks were now rolling faster. 20 kilometers per hour. 30 kilometers per hour. The bridge was swaying visibly. Already 80 tanks were on the bridge. 120, 150. The steel girders began to bend. German engineering from 1912 was fighting against Soviet steel from 1945. Tiger 224 reached the western approach to the bridge at 2:13 p.m. But something was terribly wrong. Soviet infantry had stormed out of the trees. 20 men climbed onto the Tiger. Hand grenades hammered against the armor. Müller couldn't drive onto the bridge without taking them all with him. Engelmann's radio exploded with voices. Tiger 301, this is Tiger 224. We are pinned down. Soviet infantry on our tank. Can you give us fire? The answer came from Staff Sergeant Hartmann. Negative. Our main gun is blocked. Only machine gun is functional. Tiger 417 is out of ammunition. 2:15 p.m. Engelmann watched as the 3 Tiger tanks tried to shake off the infantrymen, but it was too late. There were now 187 Soviet tanks on the bridge. The mathematical reality was brutal. If he detonated now, 15 German soldiers would die. If he didn't detonate, 200 Soviet tanks would cross the Vistula River. Behind him, only 12 kilometers away, lay the field hospital of Serok, 2,300 wounded German soldiers. No way to evacuate. No defense against tanks. If these T-34s broke through, they would all die. His hand was shaking so badly that he had to hold it with his left in his breast pocket. He carried a letter from his mother, received 3 days earlier. Karl, please come home. Your father is ill. Your sister Anna asks about you every day. The war can no longer be won. Come home. Lieutenant Müller's voice came through the radio again. Now it sounded different, desperate, anxious, human. Engelmann, I see Soviet tanks on the bridge. I know what you have to do. I understand. Then, after 3 seconds of silence, tell my wife Martha in Munich, 17 Schiller Street, that I was thinking of her. Tell her that I love her. 2:17 p.m. The Soviet tanks were now on the west side of the bridge, only 50 meters from the German Tigers. In 30 seconds, they would start shooting. The Tigers would be annihilated in minutes, but that was no longer the point. The point was the field hospital. The point was 2,300 wounded soldiers who couldn't run. The point was the tactical reality. Engelmann took 3 deep breaths. He thought of his father, who had taught him, an engineer does not serve ideologies. An engineer serves mathematical truths. The mathematical truth was clear. 15 lives against 2,300 lives. There was no other choice. He closed his eyes. He whispered, "Forgive me, Müller. Forgive me, Hartmann. Forgive me, Schmidt." Then he pressed the red button. The explosion was not loud. It was massive. 840 kilograms of military explosives detonated in perfect synchronization under 8 main girders. The physical forces were incredible. The first pressure wave traveled through the steel at 6,900 meters per second. The main girders, each 2.8 meters high and 890 millimeters thick, tore apart like paper. The bridge did not fall immediately. For 1.7 seconds, it hung in the air, held only by structural inertia and the sheer mass of the 187 tanks on it. Then physics broke through. The middle section, 180 meters long, began to fall, first slowly, then faster, then with terrible, unstoppable acceleration. 187 Soviet T-34 tanks fell 17 meters into the ice-cold Vistula River. The water was only 3.2 meters deep, but that didn't matter. Each tank struck with the weight of 26 tons multiplied by the acceleration of gravity. The force of impact crushed the crews instantly. Hatches were sealed by the pressure. Water poured through every opening. The temperature of the river was -2 degrees Celsius. Of the 935 Soviet crew members on the bridge, 262 survived. They swam or climbed out of destroyed tanks. But in -2-degree water, a human being has about 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in. The Soviet side of the bank was 340 meters away. The German side was closer, 180 meters, but there it meant captivity. 127 Soviets reached the eastern shore, 89 reached the western shore and were immediately taken prisoner. 46 died in the water, 673 died in the tanks. The 3 German Tiger tanks stood just 50 meters from the bridge when it erupted. The shockwave threw them back. All 3 were overturned by the force of the blast, but they were on solid ground. The crews were able to evacuate. Lieutenant Jack Müller crawled out of the overturned Tiger 224 at 2:21 p.m. He was injured. His left leg was broken, but he was alive. All 5 crew members of Tiger 224 survived. Tiger 301 lost 2 men, killed by the Soviet infantry before the explosion. Tiger 417 was lucky. All 5 men survived unharmed. Of the 15 German soldiers in the 3 Tigers, 13 survived. 2 died. Engelmann's decision had saved 13 German lives, instead of killing 15. The Soviet infantry riding on the tanks, 23 men in total, were all killed or severely wounded by the explosion. Engelmann watched the explosion through his binoculars. He saw the bridge collapse. He saw the tanks plunge into the water. He saw the desperate Soviet soldiers swimming. He saw the German Tigers lying on their sides. Then he saw men crawling out of the Tigers. He began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. At 13, he stopped counting and began to weep. Colonel Dmitry Morozov observed the catastrophe from his command post. He had just lost 70% of his brigade in 90 seconds. His war diary entry from that evening was found in Russian military archives in 1993. It reads like a horror story. 2:17 p.m. The bridge exploded. I watched as my entire brigade fell into the river. 187 tanks, 935 men, most drowned inside their own tanks. The water turned red with blood. The screams stopped after 20 minutes. I understood in that moment that we were fighting men who were willing to sacrifice everything, even their own comrades. The survivors carried scars that never healed. Sergeant Peter Ivanov, commander of T-34 number 447, was one of the few who escaped. His tank was only 12 meters from the edge of the bridge when it exploded. The shockwave hurled his 26-ton tank 4 meters sideways. He survived because his tank landed on solid concrete, not in the water. In an interview in 1991, he said, "I can still hear the screams. My best friend, Lieutenant David Sokolov, was in the tank right behind me. I saw his T-34 fall into the water. The hatch opened. I saw his hand. He tried to climb out. Then he disappeared." The water closed over him. He was 19 years old, married for 6 weeks. His wife Kathy was waiting in Moscow. I had to tell her after the war that I watched him die and couldn't do anything. Private First Class Alex Kuznetsov was a machine gunner in Tank 523. He survived because the hatch of his tank broke open on impact. He swam to the western bank and was immediately taken as a German prisoner of war. In a 1987 interview, he recounted, "The German soldiers who captured me were in shock themselves. They couldn't believe what they had seen. A German medic, I don't remember his name, gave me a blanket and hot tea. He said in broken Russian, 'We are all soldiers. We are all just following orders. War is hell for both sides. I spent 8 months in German captivity. The Germans treated us better than what I would have expected from my own commissars if I had returned. The psychological consequences were devastating. Of the 262 Soviet soldiers who physically survived the blast, at least 187 developed what Soviet military doctors diagnosed as combat neurosis. Many refused to ever cross a bridge again. Sergeant Mike Volkov, a survivor from Tank 618, had to be medically discharged from the Red Army in 1946 because he suffered panic attacks every time he saw a bridge. His medical report describes, "Patient exhibits extreme anxiety reactions upon sight of bridges of any kind. Heart rate increases to 160 beats per minute, uncontrolled shaking, cold sweats, flashbacks to the Modlin demolition. Patient is unfit for further military service." The tactical impact of the demolition was enormous. The 47th Guards Tank Brigade, one of the most elite Soviet units, ceased to exist as a combat-capable formation. The Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Army had to delay its entire operation by 72 hours to find an alternative crossing. The next functioning bridge was 80 kilometers south, near Warka. This 72-hour delay allowed the German 9th Army to evacuate 41,000 soldiers across the Vistula River. The field hospital in Serok was completely evacuated. All 2,300 wounded soldiers were transported west. 1,847 of them survived the war and returned home. The 2,300 wounded soldiers in Serok had no idea how narrowly they had escaped annihilation. Private Clint Hartman, 19 years old, both legs amputated after a mine explosion near Warsaw, was in bed 47 when the evacuation began. He later recalled, "We heard explosions in the distance. Then an officer came running in. Immediate evacuation. Soviet tanks 15 kilometers away. We have 3 hours. I thought we were all going to die. I couldn't walk. Many of us couldn't walk. But the medics didn't leave anyone behind. They carried us to the trucks. It wasn't until months later that I learned that a bridge demolition gave us the time to escape. Someone had made an impossible decision and saved our lives." Captain Dr. Bill Fisher, chief surgeon in Serok, organized the evacuation in 2 hours and 47 minutes. His medical report describes the panic and chaos. "We had 347 patients who were non-transportable, 2 severely wounded to be moved. I had to decide, do we leave them behind to be faster, or do we take them with us and risk that no one escapes? I decided that we would leave no one behind. Every German soldier deserves the chance to survive. We improvised stretchers out of doors. We used blankets as makeshift litters. It was chaos, but it worked. All 2,300 men were evacuated. 453 later died of their wounds, but Guards 847 survived. That's 1847 men who went home because someone blew up a bridge at the right time. The Soviet army had to change its tactics after Modlin. Every bridge was now considered a potential death trap. Vanguard units had to fully secure and inspect bridges before main forces were allowed to cross. This slowed the Soviet advance by an estimated 15 to 20% in the final months of the war. Post-war German military analysts calculated that Lance Corporal Engelmann's demolition delayed the Soviet offensive by at least a week. A week meant thousands of additional German soldiers and civilians could escape westward before the Soviet troops arrived. But the emotional price for Engelmann was priceless. He carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. After the war, he returned to Essen. He worked as a mining engineer just like his father. He married in 1951. He had 3 children. He never spoke about the war. Never. His children only learned what he had done after his death in 1987. His wife, Greta, knew something terrible lived inside him. He had nightmares every night. The same scene. He heard Müller's voice on the radio. "Tell my wife I love her." Then he saw the explosion, the falling bridge, the plummeting tanks. He woke up in a sweat, screaming. Greta held him, never asked. She knew the war damaged men in ways no woman could fully understand. In 1952, Engelmann visited Munich, 17 Schiller Street, Martha Müller's house. He stood in front of the door for 20 minutes before he found the courage to knock. Martha opened it. She was 26 years old, a widow for 7 years. She didn't recognize him. He introduced himself. "I'm Karl Engelmann. I was the combat engineer at the Modlin Bridge. I was the one who—" His voice broke. Martha understood instantly. She embraced him. She wept. But she didn't weep with anger. She wept with understanding. They spoke for 4 hours. Engelmann told her everything. The 200 Soviet tanks, the 2,300 wounded soldiers, the impossible math, the decision that was no decision. Martha listened. In the end, she said something Engelmann never forgot. "Hans knew what you had to do. That's why he told you he understood. He was a soldier. He understood duty. He understood sacrifice. You made the right decision. Don't live in guilt. Hans wouldn't want you to suffer." But Engelmann couldn't stop suffering. In 1967, after 22 years of nightmares, Engelmann sought professional help. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a psychiatrist in Düsseldorf, who was himself a war veteran. Weber diagnosed what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. His clinical report describes patient exhibits classic symptoms of war trauma, recurring nightmares, feelings of guilt despite rational justification for his actions, emotional distancing from family, inability to speak about the traumatic event. The fact that his decision was objectively correct does not lessen the emotional suffering. Patient carries the burden of a man who had to sacrifice his own comrades to save thousands of others. The therapy helped minimally. Engelmann learned to function, but he never healed. He went to work. He loved his children. He was a good husband, but a part of him was forever trapped in that frozen concrete bunker on the Vistula River, January 17th, 1945, 2:17 p.m., his hand on a red button. Lieutenant Hans Müller survived the war. He returned to Munich. He found his wife, Martha. He lived until 1994. In his will, he left a letter for Engelmann's family. The letter was delivered in 1995. It contained only 3 sentences. "You made the right decision. You saved 2,300 lives. I never blamed you." The number 200 became legendary in German combat engineer circles. At the Bundeswehr Combat Engineer School in Ingolstadt, there's a memorial plaque. It shows a bridge. Beneath it reads, Lance Corporal Carl Engelmann, 2nd Combat Engineer Battalion, January 17th, 1945. The impossible decision, 200 enemy tanks, 13 comrades saved, 2,300 wounded evacuated, duty over emotion. Soviet veterans spoke with enormous respect about Engelmann, even though most never knew his name. One Soviet survivor, Sergeant Yuri Volkov, was interviewed in 1989. He was one of the 127 who reached the Eastern Bank. His words are remarkable. Whoever blew that bridge waited until the maximum damage was possible. Militarily, it was brilliant. Humanly, it was terrible. I lost my best friends in that river, but I understand why he did it. War forces men to make impossible decisions. The technical brilliance of the demolition was later analyzed. Engelmann had placed the charges with exact precision. Each main charge was exactly 2.7 meters from the central load point of the main girder. This maximized structural damage while minimizing explosives. With 840 kilograms, he achieved what normally would have required 1,500 kilograms. German engineering training at its perfection. The psychological impact on Soviet troops was profound. After Modlin, Soviet tank crews were genuinely afraid of bridges. Many refused to cross bridges until combat engineers inspected them. This created massive logistical problems for the Red Army in the final months of the war. A declassified KGB report from 1956 discusses the Modlin Bridge disaster. The report concludes that the demolition had a lasting psychological impact on Soviet tank crews. Many veterans developed what modern psychologists would call PTSD, specifically triggered by crossing bridges. For the German Wehrmacht, Engelmann became a symbol of what a single man can achieve with courage, training, and the willingness to make the toughest decision. His story was passed down quietly among combat engineers. No official recognition, no medal, just respect. The moral dimension of Engelmann's decision is still debated today. Did he have the right to sacrifice 15 of his own soldiers to save 2,300 others? Military ethicists are divided. Some argue that a commander should never deliberately kill his own troops. Others argue that the overall calculation was clear: 15 versus 2,300, plus tactical advantage. Engelmann himself gave only one interview in 1983 to a local Essen journalist. He said, "I think about Müller and the others every day. I hear his voice on the radio. Tell my wife I love her. I visited Martha in 1952. I told her what happened. She hugged me. She said that Hans would have understood the decision, but I will never make peace with it. Some decisions are right and terrible at the same time." And modern military training uses the Modlin Bridge incident as a case study. In military academies from West Point to Sandhurst, young officers are asked, "What would you have done?" There is no right answer. There's only one truth. War forces men to make impossible decisions. The physical remnants of that bridge still exist today. In the Vistula River near Modlin, Poland, the wrecks of 187 T-34 tanks remain. Divers have photographed them. They lie in perfect rows, exactly as they fell, preserved by the cold water and the muddy riverbed. An underwater memorial for 673 Soviet soldiers who died in seconds. What can we learn from Carl Engelmann's story? Perhaps this, that true bravery, doesn't always mean heroic charging. Sometimes a bravery means having the courage to make the most terrible decision. The decision that saves lives at the cost of other lives. The decision that will haunt you forever, but was still the only right one. Engelmann died on June 12, 1987 in Essen, heart attack. He was 64 years old. His tombstone simply reads, Carl Engelmann, 1923 to 1987, combat engineer. But those who know his story see more. They see a man who had to make the hardest decision of the war and lived with it for the rest of his life. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of thousands. Real soldiers, real impossible decisions, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then support with the golden heart below. The YouTube super thanks. Every super thanks allows me to spend weeks in Polish and Russian archives, speaking with the last veterans, preserving these forgotten moments before they're lost forever. The story of Karl Engelmann and the Modlin Bridge shows us the brutal truth of war. That sometimes the right decision is the most terrible. That courage doesn't mean having no fear, but acting despite fear. That a single man with 840 kilograms of explosives and 3 millimeters of thumb pressure can change the course of a battle. 200 Soviet tanks, 15 German soldiers, 2,300 wounded men who needed to be evacuated. An impossible decision, a mathematical truth, a life marked by guilt and duty. That's the story that military historians rarely tell, but that soldiers never forget. What impressed you most about this story? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who had to make similar, impossible decisions. Letters found in attics that speak of moral dilemmas. War diaries that show that courage takes many forms. Share your family stories below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. Every story honors the men who faced impossible decisions and still found their courage.